This is Cast of Wonders, the young adult fiction podcast featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome! Episode 551. I'm Amy Brennan, editorial assistant at Cast of Wonders, and the host for this episode. Our story for today is 9 Goblins by T. Kingfisher. Episode 6. T. Kingfisher, more usually known as Ursula Vernon, is the author of many children's books, the Hugo Award-winning comic Digger, and the Nebula Award-winning story Jackalope Wives. She writes books for adults and young adults under the name T. Kingfisher, including The Seventh Bride, The Raven and the Reindeer, and the latest, A House with Good Bones. In 2021, she won the Lodestar Award for Best Young Adult Book for the novel, A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. This story is narrated by Catherine Inskip, who is also the editor for Cast of Wonders. She teaches astrophysics for a living and spends her spare time populating the universe with worlds of her own. You can find more of her stories and poems at Motherboard, The Dunesteve, Lunar Station Quarterly, Abyss and Apex, and Polytechny. And now, we've a tale to tell.
Nine Goblins by T. Kingfisher, narrated by Catherine Inskip. Episode 6. The goblins approved of the zucchini in goblin fashion. They sat around the table on barrels, crates, and anything else that would hold them, complaining happily. "This is terrible. Worst zucchini I've ever seen. Looks like baked dog turds. And they're gritty. Did you even wash them? What's with this bread? I could use it to fix my boots. I think this butter's about to turn." The 19th polished off 3 bowls apiece, 5 loaves of zucchini bread, and Mishkin and Mushkin were licking the casserole dish clean. Nasilka opened her mouth to explain the cultural differences to the elf, and that he was actually receiving a compliment, only to find him standing behind Blanchet's chair and beaming. Apparently, he really did know goblins. "OK, troops, take the man's bowls out to the pump and wash 'em, and don't half-arse it either. I want those clean enough to see my reflection. Murray, go supervise." Murray saluted idly and began herding the goblins out of the house. Blanchet started to rise and Nasilka caught his shoulder. "Not you, Blanchet. I want to see if we can do anything about your ankle." "Oh, Sarge." Sings to Trees knelt on the floor and caught Blanchet's foot in one hand. Nasilka revised her opinion of the elf's courage upwards. She'd have used tongs. "Does this hurt? Does this? How about this?" After a few moments of prodding, he dropped the foot and vanished into the kitchen, absently wiping his hands on his tunic. "Just a moment." After a minute, Nasilka got up and began wandering restlessly through the house, listening to the bang of crockery from the next room. It was a decent house. It didn't look the kind of place an enemy would live. There were no swords crossed on the walls or severed goblin heads mounted over the fireplace. The house was a little too clean and airy for a goblin, but it had a comfortable lived-in look, with battered furniture and faded rugs. There was a young raccoon in the hutch by the fire. She hooked a finger through the mesh and it licked her hand. Even the raccoons were friendly. Nasilka felt that she ought to keep her guard up because she was in enemy territory, damn it, in the very home of the foe. But it was hard when she was stuffed on the foe's zucchini bread and the foe's baby raccoon was slurping at her fingers. Sings to Trees emerged from the kitchen, arms full of pottery. Steam wreathed his face and plastered lank blonde hair to his forehead. "Your ankle'll be fine," he told the goblin, slathering some kind of herbal plaster on it. It made Blanchet smell very strongly of mustard, which was something of an improvement over smelling very strongly of goblin. "Now, drink this." Blanchet eyed the mug of murky brown herbs warily. "How do I know you're not trying to poison me?" Sings to Trees sighed and dipped a finger into the mug, then slurped the liquid off it. "There, happy?" "Well, now you've put your finger in it." Nasilka figured it was time to intervene. "Private, I know for a fact you haven't washed your hands since the war started. You have no business complaining about anybody else's fingers. Drink the nice gunk already." Blanchet rolled his eyes upwards, possibly appealing to the authority of his teddy bear. After a moment he grimaced. "He says to drink it." "Listen to the bear. The bear is smart. Also, that's an order." With a much put-upon expression, Blanchett drained the mug. Tastes like rat squeezins with too much honey, he considered. Can I get the recipe? Get out of here, muttered Nasilka, aiming a swat in his general direction. Blanchett dodged with surprising agility and hobbled out in good humour. Thanks, she said to Sings to Trees. The elf waved dismissively. He didn't try to bite, kick or gore. He's already an improvement over most of my patients. She grinned. She couldn't help it. He passed her another mug of tea. It might taste like rat squeezins, mind you, whatever a rat squeezin is. She rolled the liquid around on her tongue. You're probably happier not knowing. Anyway, tastes like mud and rancid sticks to me. He raised an eyebrow. That means it's good. He nodded. I remember. Took me a while to get used to the goblin courtesies. He gestured with his own mug. Really, thank you, she said. It's damn decent of you feeding us and letting us stay here for a few days. We're not really cut out for the woods. I'm glad to help. Sings to Trees stared into his own mug, possibly looking for the elusive rat squeezins. Anyway, if the town really is deserted, I'd be glad of company. Thanks for that, too, Nasilka said. For what? For not immediately assuming that we'd done something to the people in the village. You didn't even ask. I appreciate that. He smiled faintly. I've known too many goblins. They're crude and sometimes they're a bit wicked, but I've never known them to be vicious. It surprised me to hear there was even a goblin war. We had to do something, she bristled. He nodded. The silence stretched out while he ran a finger over the tabletop. For what it's worth, I'm sorry your people were driven to that. I wish there had been another way. Her laugh startled them both. That's the first time anybody's apologised. Odd little words, I'm sorry. Nasilka found that she didn't feel any better about the war, but she did feel a bit better about Sings to Trees. So, you said there was magic some poor wizard sent you? Nasilka nodded. I think he was trying to escape the battle, but we all came with him. It knocked him out cold anyway. Sings to Trees gave her a worried look. What did you do with him? It was embarrassing, but she suddenly found herself afraid that she might disappoint the elf, which made her feel defensive. There wasn't much we could do, she snapped. We couldn't very well take him with us, and when a bunch of goblins show up at a human town with a human body, people tend to shoot first and not bother with the questions bit at all. He was silent. Nasilka sighed. She had to stop snapping at him. He took it all as patiently as he probably took having Manticore's vomit on him, but it wasn't fair. He was one elf. She couldn't make him stand for every elf that had ever been on the other end of a sword from her. Sorry. I feel guilty and it's making me cross. We put a blanket over him and Algol got some water into him. I didn't know what else we could do. The elf nodded. Honestly, I don't know what else you could have done. Water and blanket was a good thing. I could wish for a fire and food in him, but wizards? Well, if one woke up to a goblin troop, it could go very badly. Poor guy. He pondered. I can send a pigeon to the rangers and tell them to keep an eye out for a shocky wizard in that part of the woods. He paused. If you'd like to read it first, I wasn't going to tell them about you, but I understand. Nasilka shrugged. I can't read Elvish, and it would look awfully odd if you sent them a note in Glibber, wouldn't it? There's that. Sings to Trees looked into his mug, seemed surprised to find it empty, and began digging in a tin for more tea. I wonder why the wizard picked that as an escape route, though, the elf mused. They don't do well with surprises, most of them. I'd think one would want to go to a safe place, familiar surroundings. The middle of a forest under elven protection seems a little strange. Maybe he was from around here, said Nasilka, who'd been wondering something similar herself. The humans from the town can go into the forest, right? As long as they don't cut the trees or overhunt. Sings to Trees nodded. There are fairly strict rules and quotas, and the rangers check up on those. but generally we find that as long as they know what they can and can't do, and that there'll be repercussions if they break the rules, the humans are pretty reliable." Nasilka sighed. "Maybe that was our problem. We didn't make any rules, we just left." Singster Trees shrugged. "It might not have helped. The goblin tribes go everywhere, but they're usually pretty thin on the ground. You would have had a hard time enforcing the rules, whereas elves, well, you're tall and impressive looking and you can put an arrow into a squirrel's eye from 100 paces," said Nasilka. "There's that, yeah. We had charisma and numbers and mayhem. All you had were pigs and enthusiasm. It's not your fault." She called up the goblin army in her mind's eye and had to laugh. Pigs and enthusiasm described it pretty well. The silence that stretched out was companionable. Dusk had finished with the trees and was starting to work across the yard. Crickets chirped and a few fireflies telegraphed their attractiveness to the world. She gathered the mug up to head back inside. "I should probably go make sure they haven't broken all your plates." The elf shrugged and followed. "I've learnt not to get too attached to plates. Here, take a lantern if you're headed to the barn for the night." She glanced over at Thumper, still asleep. Sleeping on a head wound worried her. She hoped the elf knew what he was doing. "I'll wake him every few hours. That's part of why I want him, where I can keep an eye on him." Thank you," she grinned, showing blunt tusks. "I seem to keep thanking you." Singster Trees grinned back. "So few of my patients can. It's a nice change of pace." Nasilka took the lantern down to the barn, where Algol and Murray were conscientiously overseeing the washing, and found, against all odds, that she was whistling. It was still the small hours of the morning. The barn was smothered in shadow and in the rather thick smell of goblin digestion. Someone was shaking her shoulder. Sergeant Nasilka opened one eye, saw the enemy standing over her, and threw herself sideways before it could bring the lantern crashing down on her head. She snatched up her club and lifted it, eyes glittering in the orange light. Said Singster Trees. Oh, right." She straightened up and climbed out of the straw. "Sorry, old habits." "I quite understand." He stood back politely while she roused Blanchett, Algol and Murray. "Out of curiosity, are you often woken up that way?" "Once. Night attack." The barn was warm, but the air coming through the door was cool and damp. She shrugged into her armour. "I broke his kneecaps." "Ah. With my forehead." "Goodness." They left the rest of the 19th behind, a symphony of snoring and gas in the dark barn. It was going to smell like a feedlot in there by dawn. Singster Trees didn't seem particularly bothered by the idea. They gathered in the kitchen. He handed around slices of toast and mugs of hot tea, which the goblins fell on gratefully. Murray wrapped his long fingers around the mug and inhaled the steam, his eyelids still at half-mast. "Now," said Singster Trees, checking through the contents of a pack, "you said there were no people and no livestock there. Did you notice anything that was there that shouldn't have been?" "There was Wiggles," said Algol, patting the kitten, who was asleep on his lap. "But he was stuck in a drain pipe, so he probably doesn't count." "Anything else?" The goblins looked at each other helplessly and shrugged. "We're not exactly experts on human farmhouses," said Murray. "We tend to see them rather briefly, and we usually have something else on our mind at the time." The elf nodded. "Well, I didn't expect anything, but I figured I'd ask. Everyone done with their breakfast?" More nods. The 19th was not big on conversation before noon. "Guess we should get going then." Nasilka nodded. "Blanchett, can you walk? I wouldn't ask, but I want Algol in charge here, and I'd rather have you along with us." This was almost true. Nasilka actually wanted the teddy bear, who seemed to have a good head on its stuffed shoulders. Blanchett tested the ankle. "Much better," he said. "The gunk helped. Shouldn't be a problem." "You let me know if it is." She nodded to Algol. "You're in charge, Corporal. If anything happens..." She realised that she had absolutely nothing to say to fill that gap, so she stopped. "Will do, Sarge. Here, pet Wiggles for luck." "Scourge of the night, Corporal." "But he likes you." Nasilka relented and petted the kitten. She probably needed all the luck she could get. Algol saluted. Nasilka saluted back. Sings to Trees watched them with an unreadable expression. She wondered if he'd sent the pigeon to the rangers, and how he explained where he'd heard about a strange wizard. They set out. It was still twilight under the trees. They left dark green tracks in the grass turned silver with dew, even Sings to Trees. Nasilka was sneakingly pleased by this. There were stories that elves could walk soundlessly and without a trace. It was nice to see that this one didn't. Fleabane the coyote kept pace with them for a few minutes before peeling off on some canine errand of his own. The forest got deeper and darker, even as the sun came up, so the net result was that the quality of light didn't change much. The ground stopped being grass and started being moss, and then stopped being moss and became nothing but slick, wet leaves. Everybody skidded a little on those, even the elf. And when you were that tall, whippy little branches tended to hit you in the face a lot more than when you were short. It occurred to Nasilka that possibly the tales of elven slyness were much exaggerated, or possibly Sings to Trees was just a real klutz. Except for the fact that they moved much more quietly and didn't fall into any poison ivy, and one of them was extremely tall, it wasn't much different than marching through the woods had been a day earlier. And then Nasilka heard something. It sounded like someone talking, but it wasn't in a language she recognised. Or was it? She could almost make out the words. It had to be nearby. She could almost hear it all. Was that one voice or two? What were they saying? The cadences were definitely speech. It wasn't an animal noise or a bird song. And if she could just get a little bit closer... It occurred to her somewhat later that she was hurrying through the woods now, trying to make out the words. She could hear the footfalls of the others behind her. Undoubtedly they could hear it too, but nobody was saying anything for fear of drowning out the words. What were they saying? She had to get a little bit closer, just a little bit, and she was sure she'd be able to make it out. She was annoyed to find that her panting was making it harder to make out the voice. Was she panting? Yes, she'd been running. She was still running, but now she'd have to get even closer, because she was wheezing like a blown horse. And Blanchett was saying, "Sarge, Sarge, what is it, Sarge?" And that was maddening, because he was drowning out the voice. Couldn't he hear it? If she could only get close enough to make out what it was saying. Sings to Trees could hear it, she was sure, because he was out in front of her now. The path had gotten very narrow, through steep dirt cliffs cut by tree roots, and it would have annoyed her that the elf was blocking her path, except that he was moving fast enough that she was having a hard time keeping up. Could he hear the voice? At least he panted more quietly than Murray, who was also wheezing, and Blanchett had fallen back. Probably he couldn't keep up with his hurt ankle, and the sounds of "Sarge" were fading behind them, and that was good because it wasn't drowning out the voice anymore. The skeletal stag landed in the path directly in front of them with a warning clatter of bone. It sounded like the mother of all rattlesnakes. Sings to Trees stopped, and Nasilka let out a cry of frustration, and Murray ploughed into the back of her. They sorted themselves out wordlessly, practically dancing in place. "We have to get past it," said Murray. "I know that," said Sings to Trees, "but it doesn't seem to want to let us." The stag lowered its magnificent white rack. "We could backtrack," said Nasilka wretchedly. Backtracking would take them away from the voice and the conversation she was almost about to understand. "No," said Murray. He wiggled past Nasilka and made a short charge at the deer, perhaps hoping to bluff it. The stag was apparently not inclined to bluff. It swung its head sideways and white bone cracked against Murray's chest, knocking him down. "Murray!" Murray rolled over and began crawling determinedly forward. Could he get between the stag's feet? Nasilka cursed the fact there wasn't room for two of them. Sings to Trees' face twisted. "I don't want to hurt you," he pleaded with the stag. "I really, really don't. I helped your mate. Please, just let us pass." Another rattlesnake clatter. The stag danced in place, feet falling perilously close to Murray's head. There was a second warning rattle. Nasilka looked over her shoulder and saw a bone doe standing there, watching them with empty eye sockets. The voice continued to talk, a conversation that was probably about nothing, but it might be something fascinating. And anyway, she'd know in a minute if she could just get a little bit closer. And then it stopped. Sings to Trees, who had been about to charge the deer, completely bare-handed, stopped with an expression of horror on his face and looked down at his hands. "Oh," he said. "Oh no." Murray said, "What in the name of the dead orc gods am I doing?" Nasilka, seeing bone deer hooves like lances around the head of her second-in-command, reached down and grabbed him by the ankles. She hauled. Murray was very heavy, but female goblins tend to be strong, all out of proportion to their size. He left long furrows in the mud behind him. The bone deer stamped a hoof and nodded to Sings to Trees. Then it turned and reached the top of the narrow defile in a single leap. There was a second clack of bone, and the skeletal doe followed. "She's still a bit short on the front foot," said Sings to Trees vaguely. "I hope it's healing. She shouldn't be making jumps like that. Oh, gods! I was going to attack that poor creature." He put his face in his hands. "I suspect that poor creature would have torn you to shreds," said Nathilka dryly. "Murray, how's your ribs?" "Sore," said Murray. "It hit me, didn't it? I don't think it wanted to hurt me, though, whatever it was. No holes." He slid a finger under his leather breastplate and winced. "Nothing broken? Gonna have some fantastic bruises to show the recruits." "It was a Cervidian," said Sings to Trees. "They're attracted to magic. I saw it the other day. I can't believe I wanted to hurt it." Nasilka thumped him on the shoulder, which was the highest point she could reach. "Get over it, soldier," she snapped, forgetting he wasn't one of her soldiers. "You didn't, and that's the important thing. The most important thing, though, is what the hell was wrong with us?" They all stared at each other. "I heard a voice," said Murray uncertainly. "So did I." "I couldn't hear what it was saying," said Nasilka. "I almost could, but I thought if I could just get closer." "It had to be right around here, didn't it?" Sings to Trees peered around the woods, puzzled. "I mean, we were really close to it, weren't we?" "I don't think we were," said Murray slowly. "We've been running, haven't we? Blanchett couldn't keep up." "Oh, gods, Blanchett!" Nasilka spun around. "We have to go get him." "He'll be fine," said Murray. "The bear'll take care of him." Sings to Trees looked at them as if they were insane, which they probably were, but Nasilka did feel a bit better. "How long were we running?" None of them knew. "At least a mile, I think," said Murray. "It's hard to tell because it's cold out and the terrain's twisty, but I don't think I usually get this sweaty over anything less." "We can't have been that close to the conversation for a whole mile," said Sings to Trees. Nasilka had already come to that conclusion, and a couple of others she didn't like at all. Murray tugged on his ponytail. "It was magic, Sarge. Had to be. A voice that makes you want to get closer to it. That could explain why the farms were empty. They all left to get closer to the voice." Nasilka chewed on her lower lip. "Maybe it worked on the animals too." Sings to Trees looked around. "I don't hear any birds," he said, "but that could just as easily be the Cervidian. It got real quiet around my farm when they showed up. I think they're just too uncanny." "Well," Nasilka rubbed the back of her neck. "Options?" "Find the source," said Murray immediately. "Find out what happened to the farmers," said Sings to Trees. Nasilka sighed. "Normally I'd say we should go back and report this, but I don't know who we'd report it to." "I could send a pigeon to the rangers," said Sings to Trees. "How long would that take?" "It depends. A few hours at least. Probably more. I didn't actually send the other one yet. It's dark, they won't fly, so I was going to wait until we get back. Although I'm surprised they're not investigating already, frankly. Nothing this big should be able to go down without them noticing." "Unless they sent somebody to investigate and the voice got them too," said Murray. Sings to Trees winced. "OK," said Nasilka. She mostly wanted to run away screaming, but she was in command and Sings to Trees was a civilian and thus should probably be protected as much as possible. And he didn't seem to be much good at sneaking. Also, there was the small problem of the village being between them and Goblin Home, and the grim gods only knew how far the range on that magic extended. Here's what we'll do. We'll find Blanchett first, then Sings to Trees goes back to the farm and we'll scout the village. We should wear earplugs, volunteered Murray. I can rig something up. I don't know how well they'll work, but if it really is a sound, we should be able to block it. Nasilka was getting ready for the inevitable argument. Sings to Trees looked like he was about to argue, when there was a very welcome interruption. Sarge! Sarge! Blanchett! She turned and waved. A familiar teddy bear atop an equally familiar helm appeared over the top of the low cliff edging the road. There you are, Sarge. Didn't know why we were running, but the bear said you were somewhere around here. Can you get down here? Sure, give me a minute. The helm disappeared. And while we're asking questions, said Nasilka slowly, why wasn't Blanchett affected? Maybe the bear's immune, said Murray. And then, when Nasilka stared at him, have you got a better answer, Sarge? She didn't, for any of it apparently. All right, she said, make up your earplugs. I want to move out as soon as he gets here.
Nasilka and Sings to Trees bonding over their different responsibilities having similarities is just so wholesome and warming, isn't it? And I like the fact that Sings to Trees was once friendly with the local Goblin tribe, and the Goblin tribe reciprocate by telling Sings to Trees what's up locally that he's been too busy to notice, and they offer to show him and help him in a limited way. And then the plot thickens. Wonderful. It's clearly a wizard, but is it the wizard they came through the portal with? And it's fascinating that Blanchett wasn't affected, yet everyone else was. Is that because of the head wound, or the fact that he has his own brand of crazy that cancels out another mage's magic? Such interesting things to be finding out. Next time. Join us again soon. We love bringing you the best audio fiction week after week, but we can't do it without your support. Your donations pay our authors, our narrators, our servers and our staff. Please consider supporting us with a monthly donation through either PayPal or Patreon. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, request us on Spotify, and consider the stories we publish for award consideration. There are lots of ways you can help. Join the discussion on the EA forum, forum.escapeartists.net, or EA Discord. Visit on Twitter at Cast of Wonders. Come say hello. Cast of Wonders is brought to you by editor Catherine Inscape, assistant editor Alicia Caporaso, associate editors Tanya Adelot, Amy Brennan, Joyce Hernandez, Somto Iheswe, Cup Jacob, Amanda Kong, Ray O, Simon Pan, Samuel Poots, Emma Smales, Denise Sudell, and Rin Yi. Our editorial assistant is Amy Brennan, our community manager is Denise Sudell, and our audio producer is Jeremy Carter. Cast of Wonders is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can download or listen to the episode on any device you like, but you can't change it or sell it. Our theme music is Appeal to Heavens by Alexei Nov, available from Promo DJ, or his Facebook page. Thank you for listening.